The axe came down so hard the stump beneath it split clean to the roots, and Elias Lockhart barely had time to step back before the two halves toppled apart like a door thrown open. "Again," said Snaga Mudbourne, not even looking at him. She was watching the wood, arms crossed over a fitted leather bodice the color of old rust, laced tight up her sternum, her forearms bare and corded with muscle beneath tusks that caught the gray coastal light. "You call that split wood, human? My grandmother's ghost could split faster, and she has been dead 30 years. Your grandmother's ghost isn't paying rent on my woodpile," Elias said, wiping sweat from his brow though the wind off the cliffs was cold enough to numb his fingers. "Or trying to court you, so far as I know." That got something out of her, not quite a laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched, tusks shifting, and for one heartbeat she looked less like a widow carved from granite and more like a woman amused despite herself. Then the look was gone, swallowed back into that flat, guarded patience she wore like armor. "No suitor has ever split wood faster than my grief grows it back," she said, and there was iron under the words, old and tired iron, the kind that had been struck too many times to ring true anymore. "You are the 9th man to try this month, Lockhart. The woodpile does not get smaller. It only grows taller with fools." Behind her, stacked against the gray stone wall of the old monastery-turned-keep that clung to the cliff's edge above the crashing sea, stood a woodpile that would have humbled a lumber camp. Elias counted the neat, split rows without meaning to dozens of them, hundreds of logs, more firewood than any household could burn in 3 winters. Suitors' offerings. Bride gifts nobody had asked for, stacked like tombstones to men who had come and failed and gone. He picked the axe back up anyway. "Then I'll be the 10th fool," he said, and split another log clean in half. It had started 3 weeks before, in the way most foolish and wonderful things start, with hunger, and a wagon that broke an axle at the worst possible bend of the coastal road. Elias Lockhart kept the crosswind in, a low stone building with a shingle roof at the crossroads where the cliff road met the trade path down from the high pastures, 4 miles inland from where the great keep of Blackwater Point loomed over the sea like a gray tooth biting the sky. He was 31 years old, unmarried, broad in the shoulder from years of hauling barrels and splitting his own firewood, and utterly, hopelessly unremarkable in every way a man might wish to be remarkable. He poured drinks. He fed travelers. He mended his own roof when the storms took shingles, and he slept alone in a bed that had been built for 2 and had never once held more than him. The famine had come the year before, a blight on the grain, a sickness in the cattle, and then, cruelest of all, a fever that swept the coast and took the weak and the old and, in the case of Snaga Mudbourne's husband Gorza, the strong as well. Fear did what fear always does to frighten people. It looked for someone to blame, and it found the orc clans who had settled the cliffside keep 2 generations back under an old treaty, tolerated but never loved, useful in war and resented in peace. Elias had watched it happen from behind his own bar, watched merchants who used to trade fairly with the keep start crossing the road to avoid orc wagons, watched a mob form outside his own in one night, torches lit, muttering about curses and blight and orc witchcraft, before he'd stood in his doorway with nothing but a fire poker, and told them there'd be no burning of anything on his crossroads while he still breathed, and they'd grumbled and gone home, because in the end they were farmers and shepherds, not killers, only frightened men looking for a fight they could win. He had ridden up to the keep 3 days later, on the pretense of trading salted fish for wool, because the truth was he could not stop thinking about the orc woman he'd glimpsed once at the market, tall as a doorway and twice as unshakable, standing over her dead husband's grave with a face like weathered stone. He had found her instead standing over a woodpile with an axe in her hand, sweat on her brow despite the cold, splitting log after log with a fury that had nothing to do with firewood and everything to do with the man beneath the ground 300 yards away, in the little cliffside burial ground where the sea wind never stopped keening. "You're not from the keep," she'd said without turning around. No, he'd admitted. I keep the inn at the crossroads, Elias Lockhart. I know what you are, innkeeper. She'd swung the axe again, split. You are the 9th man this season to ride up here with some soft excuse salted fish, wool, a message from a cousin who does not exist hoping to catch the widow's eye. The keep's elders send you. They think if I take a husband, human or orc, it will settle the treaty nerves. Calm the frightened farmers who look at my clan and see plague bringers. She'd finally turned, and the look she gave him was not cruel, but it was a wall, high and smooth, and built to keep exactly this kind of hope out. I buried Gorza 8 months ago. I do not need a replacement. Go home, innkeeper. He should have gone home. Every sensible bone in his body told him to go home, load his fish onto his cart, and never think of the cliffside keep again. Instead, he'd looked at the woodpile easily 4 times what any widow could need and said, "How much of that wood is grief and how much is firewood?" She'd gone very still. "Get off my land," she'd said, and it was not a suggestion. He'd gone. But he'd come back the next week, with no fish to trade, and picked up an axe that was leaning against the wall, and started splitting logs beside her without a word, and she had let him, and that was how it began. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of Elias riding the 4 miles from his crossroads and up the cliff road to the keep, leaving old Mara the cook to mind the taproom, and spending his afternoons splitting wood beside a widow who spoke to him mostly in insults, and occasionally, rarely, in something warmer that she seemed to regret the moment it slipped out. The keep itself was a strange, beautiful ruin of a place. A monastery once, before the orc clans had taken it under the old treaty 2 generations back. Its chapel turned into a mead hall, its cells turned into quarters, its bell tower still standing sentinel over a sea that never stopped moving. Snaga's people numbered perhaps 60 souls now, fishing the cold waters and herding goats on the cliff pastures, and they watched Elias with the same wary suspicion he'd expect. A human riding into orc territory in a season when humans and orcs alike were quick to blame each other for empty bellies and dead children. An old orc named Ruvak, who seemed to serve as something like the keep's captain, had stopped him on the second visit, spear held loose but ready. "Snaga does not need pity from a human tavern keeper," Ruvak had said. "Go back down the mountain." "I'm not offering pity," Elias had said. "I'm offering an axe and a strong back for an afternoon. She can send me away herself if she wants me gone." Ruvak had studied him a long moment, then stepped aside, muttering something in the orcish tongue that Elias didn't understand but suspected wasn't flattering. Snaga herself never sent him away, not truly, though she threatened it often enough, in a voice that carried no real weight behind the words. On the 4th visit she'd finally asked him why he kept coming, and he'd given her the plain truth because he'd never been any good at pretty lies. "Because you're the first person in this whole cruel, hungry, frightened year who's looked at me like I might be worth something more than a bar to lean against," he'd said. "And because splitting wood beside you is better than any hour I've spent alone in that inn longer than I want to admit." She hadn't answered that. She'd only swung her axe harder and split her log clean in half, and he'd thought, not for the first time, that some part of her was fighting the same battle he was, wanting something she'd told herself she couldn't have. The wood kept growing back. That was the strange, cruel magic of grief in this house. Naga chopped down her own supply every few days in long, furious sessions that left her sweating and hollow-eyed, only to have fresh logs delivered from the keep's own stores, hauled up by cart from the forest below, because grief needed feeding and firewood was the only thing she'd let herself need out loud. "Gorza used to split the wood," she told Elias one gray afternoon, 3 weeks and some days into his visits, when the wind was low enough to talk without shouting over it. He was not a large orc, smaller than me if you can believe that. But he was faster than any 2 men, and he made a game of it, said he could split a winter's wood before I finished plaiting my hair in the morning. He never lost. Elias set down his axe and just listened, because he'd learned by now that this was the only way she ever spoke of her husband sideways, mid-swing, as if the words could only escape while her hands were busy with something else. "The fever took him in 4 days," she went on. 4 days, and he had fought raiders and wolves and a winter crossing of the high pass, and none of it killed him, and then a fever no one could see killed him in 4 days while I held his hand and could do nothing but watch. She swung the axe. Split. So now I split the wood myself, faster than the grief grows back. That is the joke the keep tells about me now, the widow's wood. They think I do not hear them laughing. I don't think it's a joke, Elia said quietly. I think it's the truest thing anyone up here has ever told me. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her flat, guarded face cracked just slightly, just for a moment before she turned back to the woodpile and said, in a voice rougher than before, "Pick up your axe, innkeeper. The wood does not split itself." He picked it up. He always picked it up. The turn came on an afternoon when the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the sea below the cliffs churned white with a coming storm. Elias had ridden up as always, left his horse in the keep's rough stable, and found Snaga not at the woodpile but standing at the cliff's edge near the old burial ground, looking down at a single weathered marker among the stones. Gorza's grave, he realized, the first time he'd seen her stand at it directly instead of splitting wood in its shadow. He almost turned back. Some things a man doesn't intrude on. But she'd heard his boots on the gravel and hadn't told him to leave, so he came and stood a respectful distance behind her, hands in his pockets, waiting. 8 months, she said without turning. 8 months, and I still expect to hear him behind me. Still turn my head at the sound of an axe, thinking it is him, before I remember it is only me, or now, apparently, you. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, caught somewhere painfully between the two. "The elders want me to remarry Lockhart. Did you know that? Not for love, for the treaty. A widow leading a clan alone makes the human towns nervous, and nervous humans burn things. If I take a husband, any husband, human or orc, it steadies the peace. That is why they send suitors. That is why Ruvak lets you climb my hill 9 times running when he has run off every other man with a spear in his hand." "Is that why you let me stay?" Elias asked. "Politics." She finally turned to face him, and the wind caught loose strands of her dark hair, and her eyes, amber, fierce, rimmed with old grief, held his without flinching. "No," she said. "That is not why." "Then why?" "Because you do not look at me like a treaty to be signed or a curse to be feared," she said. "You look at me like a woman. No man has looked at me like that since Gorza died. I did not think any man would again, human or otherwise, and I did not think I wanted one to." She stepped closer, close enough that he had to tilt his head back slightly to meet her eyes, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and salt on her skin. "I still do not know if I want it, but I am tired of pretending I do not feel it when you are near, Lockhart. I am tired of splitting wood to keep from splitting open." He didn't know which of them moved first. Perhaps it didn't matter. Her hand found the collar of his coat, and his hand found the curve of her jaw, rough palm against rougher green skin. And then they were kissing at the edge of the cliff, with the storm building over the sea and the ghost of her dead husband's grave not 10 feet behind them. And it was not gentle, and it was not careful. It was hungry and startled, and both of them gripping at each other like they were afraid the wind would tear this moment away before it finished. When they broke apart, Snaga was breathing hard, her forehead pressed to his, and she laughed, an actual laugh, low and disbelieving. 8 months of suitors, she murmured, and it is the innkeeper with the crooked axe stroke who finally, she didn't finish the sentence. She kissed him again instead, and this time it lasted longer, and the storm rolled closer over the water, and for the first time in 8 months, Elias watched her stop thinking about the man in the ground, if only for a handful of stolen minutes. They did not speak of what it meant that night, not directly, though something had shifted between them that no amount of wood splitting could undo. Elias rode home before the storm broke fully, soaked through by the time he reached the crosswind inn, and lay awake in his too large bed thinking of amber eyes and the taste of salt on her mouth, and thought, with the particular terror of a lonely man who has just glimpsed happiness, that he had never wanted anything so much in his life and had no idea how to keep it. He needn't have worried about losing her interest. Snaga Mudbourne was not a woman who did things by half measures, and the very next morning, before the storm had fully cleared, she rode down the cliff road herself, the first time she had ever come to him instead of waiting for him to come to her, and found him in the yard of the Crosswind in splitting his own firewood of all things for the inn stores. She sat her horse and watched him work for a long moment, arms crossed, an eyebrow raised. "You split wood even when there is no grief to outrun." "Habit," he said, setting down the axe. "Also, I like to eat, and old Mara likes her stove hot. What are you doing here, Snaga? It's a 4-mile ride and the road's still wet from the storm." "I came to see if the innkeeper meant what he did at the cliff's edge," she said, "or if it was a storm madness that will not survive daylight." He crossed the yard to stand at her stirrup, looking up at her. She was mounted on a horse built heavy enough to carry her weight, and even so she loomed over him, and he thought, not for the first time, how strange and wonderful it was to want someone who could probably break him in half without much effort and instead chose gentleness. "I meant it," he said simply. "I've meant it since the day I saw you crying into a woodpile and decided I'd rather stand beside you than walk away." "I was not crying," she said, with wounded dignity. "You were crying, Snaga, just very, very fast with an axe in your hand." That earned him another rare, startled laugh, and she leaned down from the saddle, caught the front of his shirt in one strong hand, and kissed him soundly in the middle of his own inn-yard, in full view of the road, in full view of anyone who cared to look. And someone did care to look, because a farmer's cart rattled past on the crossroads not 10 yards off. And the farmer's jaw dropped clean open at the sight of the orc widow of Blackwater Point, kissing the human innkeeper like she meant to claim him right there in the mud. Word would travel fast after that. Neither of them cared. Word did travel fast, and not all of it kind. The famine had eased slightly by early spring, but the fear it had planted was slower to die than the hunger, and there were still men in the crossroads villages who muttered about orc curses and blighted grain, still farmers who crossed the road rather than pass an orc wagon, still a raw wound in the whole coast where grief had curdled into blame. An innkeeper courting the orc widow of Blackwater Point was, to some, a scandal worth shouting about. The first real trouble came 2 weeks later, on market day in the crossroads village of Fenmarsh, a half-day's ride south of the inn, where Elias had gone to trade salted fish and barley for the inn's stores, and Snaga had ridden with him her choice, not his, because she had grown tired of hiding whatever this was between them, and she did not believe in hiding. She wore that same fitted rust-leather bodice she always wore, laced tight, a good traveling cloak thrown over it against the wind, and she walked through the market stalls at Elias' side with her chin high and her hand resting easy near the long knife at her belt, and every conversation in that market square died the moment they passed. "Orc," someone muttered, not quietly enough, "bold as brass, walking our market like she owns it." "And him with her," another voice added, thick with disgust. "Lockhart's gone soft in the head, betting the thing that brought the blight down on us." Elias felt Snaga's hand tighten on his arm. Not fear, he realized, but restraint, the visible effort of a proud woman holding back a temper that could have flattened the man who'd spoken with a single blow. "Ignore them," he murmured. "I have ignored worse than market gossip for 8 months, she said low. "It is not the words that trouble me, Lockhart. It is the look in their eyes. I have seen that look before a mob gathers." She was right to worry. By the time they'd finished their trading and turned back toward their horses, a crowd of perhaps a dozen men had gathered near the market gate. Farmers, mostly, a blacksmith Elias recognized, a few faces he didn't know, all of them with the particular ugly courage that comes from numbers and fear. "That's far enough," the blacksmith said, stepping into their path. He was a broad man, soot-stained, with forearms like tree trunks, and he held a hay hook in one fist like he'd forgotten he was still carrying it. "We don't want her kind walking free through our market, Lockhart. Not after what her kind's curse did to our crops." "Her kind didn't curse anything," Elias said, stepping slightly in front of Snaga without quite meaning to, though she noticed, and her jaw tightened at the gesture even as she didn't stop him. The blight came from bad seed and a cold spring. You know that as well as I do, Hendon. I know an orc walked through Fenmarsh a month before the sickness took my boy, Hendon said, and his voice cracked on the last word, and Elias understood then that this wasn't really about curses at all. This was a grieving father looking for somewhere to put an unbearable pain, the same way frightened people always did. I am sorry about your son, Snaga said, and her voice was steady, and there was no mockery in it at all, only a terrible, weary understanding. I buried my own husband 8 months past. I know what that hunger to blame someone feels like. But it was not me and it was not my clan, and killing that hunger by pointing it at strangers will not bring your boy back. It only means more graves. For a moment it looked like her words might reach him. Hendon's grip on the hay hook loosened slightly, his eyes wet. But then someone in the crowd shouted something uglier, a word Elias wouldn't repeat, and the mood shifted like a wind changing, and suddenly there were more hands reaching for tools that weren't meant as weapons but could easily become them. Elias stepped fully between Snaga and the crowd then, spreading his arms slightly, making himself the wall. Enough, he said, loud enough to carry. She's done nothing to any of you. If you want to swing that hook, Hendon, you'll swing it at me first. Elias, Snaga said, a warning and something else in her voice, but he didn't move. It was Ruvak, of all people, who broke the standoff. He had ridden down with 2 other orc riders as escort, waiting at the market's edge as was custom for keep visits to human towns, and he pushed his horse forward now, spear held loose but visible, and the sight of armed orc riders was enough to make the crowd's courage falter and scatter back several steps. The widow Mudbourne has traded fairly in this market for 2 years, Ruvak said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed. If Fenmarsh wishes to end that trade over a dead boy's fever, that is Fenmarsh's choice to starve by. But there will be no blood spilled here today. The crowd dispersed, muttering, Hendon dropping his hay hook and walking away with his shoulders shaking, and Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Snaga rounded on him the moment they were clear of the square, gripping his shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Do not ever step in front of me like that again," she said, fierce and furious and frightened all at once. "You are not made of the same stuff as me, Lockhart. A hay hook could open your throat. I do not need protecting from angry farmers." "Maybe not," Elias said. "But I wasn't going to stand there and watch them come at you either, Snaga. That's not a thing I know how to do." She stared at him a long moment, something warring behind her amber eyes, and then she pulled him into a fierce embrace right there on the road, heedless of who watched, and said into his hair, in a voice thick with something she didn't often let show, "You foolish, stubborn man. You will get yourself killed being brave for me." "Then you'll have to keep me alive," he said. "Seems only fair, since you're the one who taught me the world still got things worth being brave for." The days that followed had a strange, sweet urgency to them, as if both of them understood without saying it that whatever storm had gathered around them, the fear in the villages, the treaty politics at the keep, the raw grief that still lived in Snaga's chest, might not give them very long to simply be happy, and so they should not waste the time they had. Elias closed the inn early some evenings and rode up to the keep instead of waiting for market days, and Snaga began riding down to the crossroads more often than the treaty or the wood or any excuse required, until even old Mara the cook stopped pretending. She didn't know exactly why the innkeeper had taken to grinning like a fool over his ledgers. They still split wood together, though the grief-driven fury had softened in Snaga's swing, become something closer to companionable rhythm, 2 people working side by side, because they liked working side by side, not because one of them was trying to outrun sorrow. It was on one of those ordinary, golden evenings, the 2 of them sitting on the low stone wall outside the keep's mead hall with cups of watered wine and the sea gone rose gold below them, that Snaga finally told him the rest of it, the part of Gorza's death she hadn't spoken of before. "He asked me near the end," she said, staring out at the water, whether I would let myself love again after. I told him not to be a fool, that he was not dying, that I would not entertain such talk. He made me promise anyway. Said an orc widow who locks her heart in a grave alongside her husband dishonors the years they had together, not honors them. She turned the cup in her hands. I have spent 8 months breaking that promise every day, Lockhart, splitting wood instead of grieving properly, sending suitors away before they could even finish their offer of marriage. I told myself it was because none of them were worth the trouble. And now, Elias asked, throat tight. Now there is a human innkeeper who cannot split wood to save his life, she said, and there was warmth threaded through the insult now, unmistakable, who stood in front of a mob's hay hook for me, who listens when I speak of my dead husband instead of flinching from it, who makes me feel like the woman I was before grief made me into a widow who does nothing but chop logs. She set down her cup and took his hand, her fingers swallowing his, calloused and strong and gentle all at once. I do not know how to say this without sounding like a fool, Elias Lockhart, but I think I am ready to keep my promise. If you will have a widow with an unreasonably large woodpile and a temper the elders call frightening. Snaga, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. I've been half in love with you since the first afternoon you called me a fool and let me pick up an axe anyway. I'll have you as many times as you'll let me ask. She kissed him then, slow and certain, no storm or urgency in it this time, only the quiet weight of a decision made with clear eyes, and the sea kept turning below them, indifferent and eternal, while two people who had both been alone in their own particular ways finally stopped being alone together. The marriage, when it came faster than either of them had quite planned, though neither regretted the speed of it. It was Ruvak in the end who pushed for it, cornering Elias one afternoon at the keep stable with the blunt directness that seemed to be his only conversational mode. The elders grow restless, he said. A widow courting a human innkeeper is gossip the keep can survive. A widow married to one settles the gossip into something the treaty can use. The frightened towns will see it as a sign of peace, not scandal, once it is done properly before witnesses. Half measures invite trouble, Lockhart. Full measures end it. That's a fine political argument, Elias said, but I'd rather marry her because I love her than because it settles a treaty. Can it not be both? Ruvek asked, with the ghost of something almost like humor in his flat orc features. Snaga will not marry for politics alone. I have known her since she was a girl throwing spears at targets twice her height, and stubbornness is the truest thing about her. But she will not refuse a marriage that is both true and useful if the truth of it is strong enough. Ask her, human. Ask her properly, before the season turns and the elders find some other fool to push at her instead. So Elias asked her properly, on the cliff's edge near Gorza's grave, because it felt right to ask her there, in the place where grief had first cracked open into something else between them, not to erase the man who had come before, but to stand honestly beside his memory and ask if there was room still for one more vow. Snaga Mudborn, he said, kneeling in the wind with her rough hand in both of his, I don't have much to offer you. An inn at a crossroads, a bed too big for one person, a heart that's been waiting its whole foolish life for someone exactly like you to walk into it swinging an axe. But everything I have is yours if you'll take it. Marry me. She looked at him for a long moment, and then down at Gorza's weathered marker, and something passed over her face that was grief and love and peace all tangled together, and she said, Gorza made me promise. I think he would like you, Lockhart. He would say you split wood terribly, and he would be right, and he would still like you. She pulled him up to his feet and kissed him hard. Yes, I will marry you. Before the whole coast, before every frightened farmer and every suspicious elder, I will marry you, and I will not be quiet about it. The wedding was held 3 weeks later, at the keep itself, in the old chapel-turned-mead hall, with orc custom woven through human tradition in a way that made both peoples in attendance a little uneasy and a little moved despite themselves. Snaga wore her fitted rust-leather wedding bodice, the finest version of the garment she always wore, decorated for the occasion with silver thread worked through the laces. And Elias wore his one good coat, and Ruvak stood as witness for the clan while old Mara stood, weeping unashamedly, as witness for the human side of things. There was an orc custom to it too. One Snaga insisted on, despite the elder's mild disapproval, a claiming mark, cut shallow and deliberate along the meeting of thumb and wrist, hers and his, pressed together so the blood mingled, an old rite meaning I choose this, permanently, before witnesses, no going back. It stung, but Elias didn't flinch, and Snaga's eyes were fierce and wet with something like pride as she watched him hold steady through it. "There," she said low just for him, pressing her marked wrist to his. "Now no elder, no treaty, no frightened farmer can call this anything but true. You are mine, Elias Lockhart, and I am yours, and I will not apologize for either fact to anyone." "Wouldn't want you to," he said, and kissed her in front of the whole gathered hall, and the cheer that went up, orc and human voices mingling for once in something other than suspicion, was the loudest sound Elias had ever been glad to hear. That night, after the feast had wound down and the guests had scattered to their beds or their long rides home, Snaga led Elias not to the small chamber she'd occupied since Gorza's death, but to a different room entirely at the top of the old bell tower, where a bed had been made fresh with new linens, and the window stood open to the sound of the sea below. "I could not marry you in the room where I grieved him," she said simply, by way of explanation when he asked. "That room was for mourning. This room is for you, for us. I want new walls to hold what we are building, Lockhart, not old ones that remember only loss." The night that followed rewrote something fundamental in both of them, not reckless in the sense of careless, but reckless in the way that only comes when two people have spent months circling a truth and finally stop circling it, when restraint gives way all at once to something neither of them tries to slow down. Snaga was as fierce and certain in this as she was in everything else, guiding him with a confidence that left no room for his usual quiet uncertainty. Her strength gentled deliberately, carefully, in a way that told him more clearly than any words could that she had chosen this, chosen him, with her whole considerable will. He matched her as best a mortal man could match a force like her, and what passed between them in that tower room, with the sea wind moving the curtains and the old bell silent above them for the first time in months, was not just consummation of a marriage but a kind of vow spoken in an older language than words, warm and searching and unhurried once the first hunger had been answered. Until they lay tangled together in the new linens with the gray dawn creeping toward the window and neither of them wanting to be the first to move. "I did not think I would feel this again," Snaga murmured against his chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns over his heartbeat. "This wanting. This being wanted. I had folded that part of myself away with Gorza's things and told myself it was gone for good." "I'm glad it wasn't," Elias said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm glad you unfolded it for me. Do not go soft and poetic on me now, innkeeper," she said, though her voice was warm as summer stone. "I will have to divorce you for excessive sentiment." "There's no divorcing after a blood claiming, and you know it," he said, laughing. And she laughed too, low and real, and pulled him closer. And outside the tower the sea went on turning gold with the coming morning, indifferent as ever to the small, enormous happiness of two people who had finally stopped being alone. Married life did not erase the wider troubles of the coast, though for a handful of weeks it felt almost as though it might. Trade between the keep and the crossroads towns eased somewhat, word of the marriage spreading in the way such news does, and there were even a few farmers not Hendon, whose grief still ran too raw, but others, who began trading with the keep's orc riders again without the old suspicion twisting their faces. The Crosswind Inn found new life too, as travelers came from farther afield to see the innkeeper who'd married the orc widow of Blackwater Point, some out of scandalized curiosity, most leaving having bought a meal and a room, and a slightly softened view of orcs than they'd arrived with. But the famine's wounds ran deeper than a wedding could heal, and it was barely 2 months into their marriage when the true danger came, not from a mob with hay hooks this time, but from something far more organized and far more dangerous. A band of raiders, human deserters and hungry men turned outlaw by the famine's cruelty, had been working the coastal road for weeks, striking wagons and lonely farms, and word reached the keep that they had grown bold enough to plan something larger. A raid not on a wagon but on the keep's own stores, timed for a night when they believed the orc riders would be thinned out on patrol. They had not accounted for Elias. It happened on an evening when Elias had ridden up to the keep as had become his habit, planning to stay the night as Snaga's husband now did more often than not, when the alarm bell in the old tower began ringing wild and frantic just after dusk. Elias ran out into the keep's central yard to find chaos torches, shouting, the raiders having used the cover of a supply wagon to get inside the outer gate before anyone realized they weren't traitors at all. There were perhaps 15 of them, armed with a mismatched collection of swords, spears, and stolen crossbows, and they had moved fast and ruthlessly, cutting off 2 young orc guards and taking them at spearpoint before the rest of the keep could properly rally. Ruvek and the main body of riders were 3 miles out on patrol, too far to reach in time. It was Snaga, striding out of the mead hall with her long knife already drawn, who faced the raiders' leader directly across the yard. The leader was a rangy, hard-eyed man named Cordwin, once a soldier by the look of his ruined uniform coat, now clearly a man who had decided the world owed him a debt it would pay in orc blood and stolen grain. He held one of the young orc guards, a girl no older than 17 named Ashka, with a knife at her throat, and his men held the other, an older guard named Doran, in similar fashion a few feet away. Nice and simple, Cordwin called across the yard, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who has done this kind of thing before and knows exactly how it usually goes. Open your stores. Grain, salt, fish, whatever you've got hoarded up here while the rest of the coast starves. Do it quiet and these 2 live. Fight me, and I open their throats before your riders can even climb the hill. Snaga's face had gone to that same flat, dangerous stillness Elias had seen the day they'd first met at the woodpile, except now there was no grief in it, only a cold and furious calculation. You will not leave this keep alive either way, she said. You know that. You have taken orc lives before human witnesses on treaty land. There is no version of tonight where the elders let that stand unanswered. Maybe, Cordwin said, but your girl here dies first if you try anything clever, widow, so you tell me. Grain for a life. Simple trade. It was then that Elias understood, with a cold lurch in his stomach, exactly what Snaga intended to do, a half-second before she did it, because he had spent enough months watching her to know the particular set of her shoulders when she had decided something and would not be talked out of it. She sheathed her long knife. Take me instead, she said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, stepping forward with her hands spread open, empty, deliberately unarmed. Let the girl go. Let Doran go. Take me as your hostage instead, Cordwin. An orc widow with a treaty marriage to a human innkeeper is worth 10 times what you get for grain alone. The keep will pay anything to have me back unharmed, and so will Fenmarsh's own council, who would rather see the peace held than broken over a dead widow. You gain more holding me than you gain holding 2 frightened guards, and whatever grain you can carry on your backs before my riders return. Snaga, no, Elias started forward, but 2 of the raiders swung crossbows toward him, and he froze, every instinct screaming at him to move, and every scrap of sense telling him that moving got him killed and did nothing to help her. Cordwin considered her offer with the calculating eye of a man used to weighing risk against profit, and Elias watched, heart hammering, as the raider leader's gaze slid over Snaga, her size, her evident strength even unarmed, the fact that she stood taller than any man in that yard and clearly decided that a hostage who could crush a windpipe with one hand was a dangerous gamble even bound. Bind your own wrists first, Cordwin said slowly. In front of everyone. Then we talk trade. Snaga did not hesitate. She crossed the yard toward him with a steady, unafraid stride and knelt, and held out her wrists, the very wrist that bore the pale scar of her claiming mark. Elias realized with a sick jolt, exposed now to a raider's rope, and one of Cordwin's men bound them tight while the whole yard watched in horrified silence. Snaga, Elias said again, and his voice broke on her name, and she turned her head to look at him, and even bound and kneeling in the mud with a knife's edge of danger all around her, her eyes held nothing but calm certainty. "Trust me," she said just to him, quiet enough that the raiders might not have caught the words at all. "I did not survive a husband's death and 8 months of grief to die kneeling in my own yard, Lockhart. I know exactly what I am doing." Cordwin released Ashka and Doran, shoving them both roughly toward the mead hall, where waiting keepfolk pulled them to safety, and then he hauled Snaga up by the bound wrists, a knife at her throat now in place of the young guards, and began backing his men toward the gate with her as a shield. Elias' mind raced. He had no sword, no spear, nothing but the small hunting knife he carried at his belt for cutting rope and cheese, utterly useless against 15 armed men. But he had something else, something he understood better than any weapon he knew. This keep, knew its yard, knew exactly where the old well stood with its worn stone lip, right in the raider's path to the gate, hidden partly by shadow and the dusk light. He also knew, with sudden clarity, exactly what kind of woman he had married, and he trusted that clarity more than he had ever trusted anything in his life. As the raiders moved past the well, Elias shouted, not a battle cry, nothing so dramatic, just her name, sharp and sudden. "Snaga, now." And she, understanding instantly, dropped her full weight backward and down, using her bound hands as a fulcrum to slam her whole body against the raider gripping her, sending them both crashing into the well's stone lip. The knife at her throat scraped a shallow line along her jaw but did not find its mark, and in the chaos of the fall Elias was already moving, sprinting across the yard, snatching up a dropped spear from where one of the young guards had lost it, and driving its butt end hard into the skull of the raider struggling to right himself over Snaga's pinned form. The man went down. Snaga, hands still bound but freed of the blade at her throat, brought both knees up and drove them into the chest of another raider reaching for her, sending him sprawling, and Elias was there an instant later, cutting her bonds with his small, useless hunting knife that turned out to be exactly the right tool for exactly this moment. The rest of the yard erupted then keepfolk, who had been frozen with fear, finding their courage now that the standoff had broken, throwing whatever tools and stones came to hand, and the sound of horses on the road announcing Ruvak's patrol returning at a dead gallop, drawn by the alarm bell. Cordwin, seeing his careful plan collapsing into chaos, shouted a retreat, and what remained of the raiders fled through the gate and into the dark, leaving 2 of their number groaning on the ground and their careful, cruel plan in ruins. Elias didn't watch them go. He was on his knees in the mud, pulling Snaga into his arms, his hands shaking as he checked the shallow cut along her jaw, checked her wrists where the rope had bitten into skin, checked every inch of her for wounds he might have missed in the chaos. "You absolute, reckless, magnificent fool," he said, voice cracking. "You offered yourself to a knife, Snaga. You could have died." "I did not die," she said, breathless, catching his face in her bound, scraped hands. "I calculated the risk, Lockhart, same as I calculate every risk." Cordwin was greedy and cautious in equal measure, which meant he would take time deciding what to do with me instead of simply killing me outright. I gambled on that hesitation, and on you understanding what I needed from you the moment I gave you the signal. I was right on both counts. "You could have told me the plan," he said, still shaking. "There was no time, and you would have argued," she said, entirely unrepentant. "And I did not have the luxury of arguing with my husband while a knife sat at my throat." Her voice softened then, some of the fierce calculation draining out of it, replaced by something rawer. I would rather offer myself than watch that girl die, or watch you try something foolish and get yourself killed for it. I have buried one person I loved already, Elias. I could not bury a second. So I made myself the safest hostage in that yard because I trusted my own strength, and I trusted you to know exactly when to act." He kissed her then, right there in the mud, heedless of the blood on her jaw or the rope burn on her wrists, kissed her like the world had nearly ended and hadn't. And around them, the keep folk who had watched their widow offer her own life to save two young guards began, one by one, to lower whatever makeshift weapons they'd grabbed, and to look at Snaga Mudborn not as a curse or a political convenience, but as something closer to what she truly was, their protector, fierce and unbreakable. Married now to a human innkeeper, who had proven himself just as fierce in his own quieter way. Ruvek arrived moments later with the returning patrol, took one look at the scene, the bound rope cut and discarded, the raiders fled, Snaga alive and furious and glowing with the aftermath of danger survived, and simply said, "I will take the riders after Cordwin's band. They will not trouble this coast again." Then to Elias with something that might almost have been respect in his flat orc features, "You knew exactly when to strike, human. That is not luck. That is trust, hard-earned." "She earned it," Elias said, still holding Snaga against him. "Every bit of it." Word of the standoff spread down the coast faster than any wedding announcement had, and it did more for the treaty, and for the two people's fragile trust than any amount of careful diplomacy could have managed. Because a story about an orc widow offering her own life to save two young guards, and a human innkeeper cutting her free with nothing but a cheese knife and steady nerve, was the kind of story that traveled from tavern to tavern and grew a little more legendary with each telling. Until even Hendon, the grieving blacksmith, rode up to the keep himself, weeks later, not to apologize exactly, because grief does not always know how to apologize, but to bring a length of good rope as a wedding gift, muttering something about owing a debt for the two riders' lives, and Snaga had accepted it with a grave nod that cost her nothing and gave him, Elias suspected, exactly the small dignity he needed to let go of some part of his anger. The wounds of the famine did not vanish overnight. There were still frightened people on that coast, still suspicion that would take years rather than weeks to fully heal, but something had shifted. Some crack of light led into a hard season, and it had happened because two people had chosen each other loudly, publicly, unapologetically, in a world that had wanted them to stay separate and afraid. Life at the crossroads settled into something Elias had never quite dared to imagine for himself. Not perfect, never entirely free of trouble, but full in a way his years of solitary innkeeping had never been. Snaga split her time between the keep, where her presence still mattered to her clan and the treaty both, and the Crosswind Inn, where she took to standing behind the bar some evenings with an ease that startled travelers half to death, the first time they walked in expecting a quiet crossroads tavern, and found an orc widow pouring their ale with a look that dared them to comment. Most didn't. A few tried in the early months, and found themselves matched insult for insult until they either laughed or left, and word spread that the innkeeper's wife had a tongue as sharp as her axe swing, and somehow that became part of the inn's charm rather than its scandal, travelers coming out of their way just to see the pair of them together, the mismatched, magnificent, unlikely marriage of the crossroads. The woodpile at the keep never fully disappeared. Some habits outlive their original purpose and become simply a part of a person, a comfort rather than a wound. But it stopped growing the way it once had, stopped being the desperate outrunning of grief that it had been in those first raw months of widowhood. Now, when Snaga split wood, Elias split it beside her badly, always a beat slower than she was, and she teased him for it every single time, and he let her, because some competitions were worth losing on purpose for the sake of the laugh it earned him. "Gorza would still be faster than either of us," she told him one evening, months into their marriage, the two of them working through the last of the season stack under a sky gone violet with early dusk. He is likely laughing at both of us from wherever the dead go, at how slow his widow has gotten. I like to think he'd be glad, Elias said, setting down the axe to catch his breath, that the wood doesn't need outrunning anymore. Snaga considered that, resting her own axe against her shoulder, sweat glistening at her collarbone above the laces of her leather bodice, and something soft moved across her fierce features. No, she agreed. It does not need outrunning anymore. It is only wood now, Lockhart. Only wood, and a husband too slow to keep pace with it, and I find I do not mind the slowness at all. She kissed him then, unhurried in the fading violet light, and somewhere below the cliffs the sea kept its endless rhythm, indifferent to grief and joy alike, and the widow's woodpile stood modest and manageable at last, no longer a monument to loss, but simply the ordinary, comfortable stack of firewood belonging to two people who had chosen, against every fear and every frightened voice on that coast, to build a life together instead of standing alone. It was late in that same autumn, the air sharp with the first bite of true cold, when the last thread of trouble finally came to a head. Not raiders this time, nor mobs, but something quieter and in its way harder. The keep's elders, gathering formally for the first time since the wedding to discuss, bluntly, what came next for a widow who had married outside the clan. Elias had not been invited to the gathering, held in the old chapel hall with only orc voices permitted to speak on matters of clan law, and he had spent the better part of an anxious afternoon pacing the stable yard, half expecting Snaga to emerge with news that the elders had decided, treaty or no treaty, marriage or no marriage, that she belonged to the clan's future in some way that had no room for a human husband and a crossroads inn. When she finally emerged, striding out of the chapel hall with her jaw set and her eyes bright with some emotion he couldn't immediately name, his stomach dropped straight through the stable yard's cobbles. "Snaga," he started, "whatever they decided." "They asked me to remain at the keep permanently," she said, cutting him off, "to lead the clan formally in Gorza's place, a role I have avoided taking fully since his death because I did not trust myself to lead while still grieving so raw. They believe I am ready now. They believe the marriage and what happened with the raiders has proven I can hold both the clan's respect and a husband's love without one diminishing the other." That's Elias swallowed. "That's a good thing, isn't it? An honor." "It is," she agreed, "and I told them I would consider it on one condition they did not expect me to name." She stepped closer, close enough to take his face in both her hands, calloused and warm despite the cold air. "I told them that wherever I lead this clan, my husband leads beside me, not as some ornamental human tolerated for treaty's sake, but as a full voice in this keep's councils, and that the Crosswind Inn does not close because it is as much a part of what we are building together as this keep is." They argued. I did not yield. In the end, they agreed, because they have learned this past year that arguing with me costs them more than it gains them. Relief crashed through him so hard his knees nearly gave. "You didn't have to fight them for me, Snaga. I'd have understood if the clan needed. I did not fight them for you," she said, firm. "I fought them for us. There is no version of my life now that does not have you fully in it, Elias Lockhart, standing beside me, not behind me and not beneath me. I chose you at that woodpile, badly and slowly at first, and I choose you now. And I will keep choosing you every single day the elders or the world or anyone else tries to suggest there is some version of my future that leaves you out of it." Her voice had gone rough, fierce, utterly certain. "You are not a fool who split wood for a hopeless widow, Lockhart. You are the reason the widow stopped being hopeless at all." He kissed her then in the stable yard, with the autumn wind cutting cold and bright around them, and felt, for the first time since he'd watched that mob gather outside his inn with torches lit and fear in their eyes, that the world had genuinely, permanently turned a corner toward something better. They did not stay settled long in the end, not because trouble found them again, but because Snaga Mudbourne had never been a woman built for perfect stillness, and neither, Elias was discovering, was he. It happened on an evening some weeks later, the two of them sharing a bowl of old Mara's fish stew at the Crosswind Inn's own hearth, when a traveling trader passed through with news from farther up the coastward of a fishing village 2 days' ride north, struggling under the same famine's tail-end cruelty, where old trade routes had broken down, and an orc settlement there stood accused, unjustly, of the same curses and blights that had nearly torn Blackwater Point apart the year before. Snaga went very still at the news, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth, and Elias watched something kindle behind her eyes that he recognized now as well as he recognized his own reflection, not restlessness exactly, but purpose, the particular fire of a woman who had fought her way through her own grief and her own coast's fear, and could not now sit comfortably by a warm hearth knowing the same fight was happening somewhere else, unresolved. "They will tear each other apart up there," she said quietly, "the same way this coast nearly did if no one intervenes before the fear calcifies into violence." "You want to go," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "I want to go," she confirmed, meeting his eyes. "The elders can manage the keep without me for a season. Ruvek is more than capable, and the treaty here is settled now, steady enough to hold. But I cannot sit by this fire knowing that fight is happening 2 days' ride away and do nothing, when I know exactly what that fear looks like from the inside, and exactly what it takes to break it before it breaks people." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I would ask you to come with me. Not because you owe the world your bravery again, Lockhart, but because I do not want to face it without you beside me. The inn can survive old Mara's care for a season. Can you leave it?" Elias looked around the low stone room that had been his whole small world for a decade, the hearth, the worn bar, the too large bed upstairs that had once held only him and now never would again, and found, to his own mild surprise, that the answer had never been in question at all. "I split wood faster than grief could grow it back for you once," he said, standing, already reaching for his coat. "I imagine I can split a road north just as fast, if it means standing beside you while you do what needs doing. Let me tell old Mara to mind the taproom. We ride at first light." Snaga's smile, when it came, was the widest, most unguarded thing he had seen on her face since the wedding, fierce and warm and utterly certain, and she pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of fish stew and salt wind, and the particular joy of a woman who had never expected, after 8 months of grief and a lifetime of proving her own strength alone, to find someone who would simply saddle a horse and ride into trouble at her side without a second thought. They left before dawn the next morning, the Crosswind Inn's shutters latched and old Mara grumbling good-naturedly about fools who couldn't sit still even in their own honeymoon year, the crossroads behind them and the coast road stretching north into gray morning mist, Snaga Mudbourne riding tall and fierce beside her husband, Elias Lockhart, an axe strapped to his saddle beside his cheese knife, and a stubborn, hopeful heart that had once belonged to no one and now belonged, wholly and gladly, to her. The sea kept its endless rhythm below the cliffs as they rode, indifferent to grief and joy, and the long, hard, beautiful work of two people choosing each other again and again against a world too frightened to understand what it was watching. But those who did watch, the fishing folk on the shore path, the shepherds on the high pasture, the last few farmers still wary of orc riders on their roads, saw something worth remembering in the sight of them. A widow who had once split wood faster than grief could grow it back, and the husband who had matched her stroke for stroke until grief stopped growing at all, riding together now toward whatever trouble the world had left to offer, unafraid, unhurried, and entirely, unshakably in love.